Welcome to my second video on finite and non-finite verbs. Since my previous video, I have created a lovely poster where we can look at the difference. So what you'll see here on the poster, which is available if you'd like it, is that we have finite and non-finite verbs. The finite verbs take the first half of the poster to the middle. There's a line there. And then the non-finite verbs take the bottom half of the poster. So you will see there are 4 finite verbs. We have what I call finite Fani and his auxiliary dog. We have already discussed them as an example of finite verbs in my first video. What we have on this poster is an indication of the other finite verbs. So we have what I call Linda, the linking verb. She's also a finite verb. For instance, Linda appears friendly. So some textbooks like Lutheran and Pincus, which is prescribed in South African high school classes, will say that Linda is Fani's wife. Is also a linking verb, and that's why I've listed it here. It is, of course, the verb to be, or if Linda were not a farmer's wife, she would be a horticulturalist. So there you have the subjunctive tense. If Linda were not that, she would be something else. So what we have here is, on the poster you'll see a set of linking verbs. Linda, the linking verb, is our third finite verb. Please note that some textbooks say that is, am, are, were, was is the auxiliary. So some people say that our auxiliary dog is the to be. So there's a slight difference there, and I, however, have listed it here going on what Lutheran and Pincus says. Anyway, the main thing is our cute characters. We have Fani, who's finite Fani. So Fani cooked dinner last night. Cooked would be the finite verb in that sentence because it relates to a subject. It has a tense. It's past simple tense, and it has a number. Fani cooked, it's singular. So he had a large slice of pizza. Had, also finite Fani. It's as good as saying he ate a large slice of pizza. And auxiliary dog had stopped work. Had is the auxiliary had, and stopped is something else which we'll talk about in a while. So as you can see, the auxiliary dog can be the finite verb. It can take the position of Fani and be the finite verb. Auxiliary dog has herded animals for Fani for many years. Has is your auxiliary. Herded is something else which we'll talk about. Then the fourth finite verb is what I call the transitive and intransitive verbs, or our trans party piglets. They're rolling in the mud. Piggy and Piglet. Piggy eats Fani's apples. That's a transitive verb, eats, because Piggy is subjecting the apples to his eating. It's a direct object. But if you say Piglet is happy in the mud, there's no direct object there. So that's the intransitive verb. So as long as you remember, our little cute trans party pigs are also part of our finite verb set. They are the transitive and intransitive verbs. So this poster shows very clearly at the top you have all your finite verbs. You have finite Fani, you have auxiliary, you have the linking verb Linda, and you have the transitive and intransitive trans party pigs. All these finite verbs have to appear in a sentence to make a sentence. A sentence cannot be a sentence without a finite verb. For instance, we say, I am swimming at 10 a.m. today. I am swimming. Am would be your auxiliary finite. You can't say I swimming at 10 a.m. Why not? Because swimming comes down here to the non-finite. I am swimming would be a present participle, like whispering here. So you can't have these non-finite verbs alone in a sentence. They have to combine with the more sturdy finite verbs at the top. So the non-finite verbs are more flimsy, they're not as sturdy as the finites. And as I've said before, we have the infinitive fairy. The infinitive is to dance. You could say the bare infinitive is simply dance. So we need to know the bare infinitive for a lot of tense formations. But do remember that to dance, to walk, to sing, to run is the beautiful little infinitive fairy. So the poster will remind you the dancing fairy, the ballerina dancer, is to dance, the infinitive. Then we have number 2, non-finite verb, the past participle. Number 3, the present participle. And here on the poster you have examples, sentences of the past participle and the present participle, and a reminder that the past participle is your third column, your V3 in school handbooks, and I call these two the giggly girls. They're also very light and they're very dainty. They are non-finites. And then of course we have a gerund, also non-finite. He's our cross-dresser. He looks like something from a different era, but in today's terms, one might think that he's a bit of a cross-dresser. Is he a man or is he a woman? It's not quite sure. It looks like he's wearing a woman's frill and a woman's stocking, so I call him our cross-dressing gerund. And what we have here is the reminder that gerund is a crossbreed of sorts. He's a verbal noun, so he's got aspects of a verb and aspects of a noun. Here are some examples. Swimming is refreshing. So you can say swimming sounds like a verb, yet it's a thing that you enjoy, an activity. Drinking is refreshing. Posing is cool. Or you could say the understanding of the teacher is appreciated. So a bit of a verb flavor, a bit of a noun flavor, and that gives us gerund. You have to see here, of course, that the ing, swimming, can be either a gerund or it can be the present participle, like whispering. So there are two ways to use the ing, either in the non-finite gerund or in the non-finite present participle. There's a third way, which we'll come to later, which is a verbal adjective, but we're not going to worry with it now. What I want to show you is how finite and non-finite verbs combine. You can have many different types of verbs in one sentence, and finite and non-finite verbs don't necessarily occur next to each other. For instance, Fani loves his life and is obviously enjoying himself. So, is enjoying over here, the word obviously has come in the middle. It still means that is enjoying forms your finite verb together. Is your auxiliary, and enjoying is a present participle, and together those two words will form your finite verb. So in this little paragraph on the poster, I've used all the finite and non-finite verbs to show you how they work. So you can have a look at that when you order the poster. But I'm going to show you some more examples now of how we use finite and non-finite verbs. The poster is really just there so that you can clearly remember all of these categories. The finites at the top and the non-finites at the bottom. And that is the full extent of finite and non-finite verbs. There are no more than those on the poster. But to give you an example, let's look at some example sentences. So now we know about finite and non-finite verbs. But how do they combine? Okay, please remember that a subject and a verb is what we need to make a sentence. You can't have a sentence without a subject and a verb. So you might say, she eats cake. She is your subject. Eats is your verb. It's the present simple tense because it can be a habit. She eats cake every day. Eats will be your finite verb. It's always nifty to see that the finite verb is often the verb closest to your subject. We know it's a finite verb because it has a tense, it has a number, and it relates to the subject. Here we have, I loved my ex-boyfriend. There you have the past simple tense. Loved indicates past simple tense. We know it's a finite because it relates to I. It has a number, it's singular, I loved. And we also know that it has an agreement with that subject and a tense. Look at this. Shauna is a teacher. Shauna is a teacher. The verb to be is becomes your finite. What about this? We had a chemistry lesson yesterday. Here you have what would be called an auxiliary, and it is your finite. We had a chemistry lesson yesterday. Finite verb. It is auxiliary dog, who can stand in the place of his master Fani. How about this? This is quite a long sentence. Our study group worked really late last night. It doesn't matter how long the sentence is, every sentence needs at least one finite verb. Worked is past simple tense and it relates to the subject, our study group. What about this sentence? My father, who loves his dog, went to the vet. So your main clause is my father went to the vet. There's a little other clause in here which is called a dependent clause, who loves his dog. This clause here also has a finite verb. The who relates to my father loves his dog. But we call it a dependent clause because it can't exist on its own. It is dependent on the main clause. The main clause, my father went to the vet, gives the main meaning of the sentence, and who loves his dog will tell you probably why he went. He loves his dog, so he took his dog to the vet. This is just to show you, here we have a finite, here we have a finite. But this finite occurs in the main clause, and this finite occurs in the dependent clause, which gives extra information to fill out the meaning. There are many types of dependent clauses, such as when the president arrives, all the people will cheer. All the people will cheer, main clause. When the president arrives, dependent clause. It still has a finite verb, arrives. If you can work on Sundays, you will make lots of money. Because obviously you'll be putting in extra hours. So you will make lots of money, main clause. If you can work on Sundays is your dependent clause. It still has a finite verb. How about this? Until the sun sets. We will sit here and enjoy ourselves until the sun sets. We will sit here is your main clause, and it has another little clause, and we will enjoy ourselves until the sun sets is your dependent clause. Sets is a finite verb. So that's just to show you that you could insert dependent clauses into a sentence, add them to the main clause, and in that way you'll have two finite verbs or more in one sentence. So now we are really getting into using finite verbs more thoroughly. Remember what I said, that you can find a combination of finite and non-finite in one sentence. In fact, a non-finite can never exist in a sentence on its own. Remember from our poster, non-finites are just way too flimsy and delicate. The fairies and the little giggly girls and gerund, they're too delicate. They can't exist without the more sturdy farming community at the top, the finite verbs. So you could say the finite verbs are the farmers and all the things that are part of the farm, And the non-finite verbs are the little magical creatures that exist alongside the main sturdy characters. So let's look at these sentences. My sister went to school to become a doctor. You might remember this sentence from my first video. My sister went to school. There you have your finite verb. To become a doctor. Here you have the infinitive fairy. So what you have here, you've attached a non-finite to a finite to fill out the meaning. You could say, my sister went to school is the main clause, and to become a doctor is a phrase. Now, why are we talking about phrases if previously we spoke about dependent clauses? Well, it's a phrase because it's only a few words. It's not a sentence, but it's also a phrase because it's using a non-finite verb, to become. So it's much lighter than a clause. Over here, who loves his dog was a clause because it uses a finite verb. Coming back to this, my sister went to school to become a doctor. This combines a main clause with a phrase. The phrase employs the non-finite verb, the infinitive, fairy, and the main clause employs the finite verb, finite farni. Sorry, this one is actually linking Linda, went. Okay, so went, or you could say it's the verb to be, sometimes classified as linking Linda, sometimes classified as auxiliary dog, depending on your source. But whatever the case, both Linda and your auxiliary dog are the finite verb. So, non-finite verbs, just to give you a reminder, we can say to swim is the infinitive. I am swimming at 4 p.m., where swimming would be the present participle. Swimming is refreshing. That's your gerund, because it's got that noun quality, even though it seems like a verb. And I had swum in that river before the drought is your past participle, because we know swim, swam, swam. The third column is your past participle. So just a little example here of non-finite verbs: to swim, swimming, swimming, and swam. There you have all 4 examples of your non-finite verbs. Let's go on to see how these things combine. Let's look at the non-finite. What we have here is what a lot of grammar sources call a verb phrase. So when we talk about a verb phrase, as I've said, a phrase is a few words. It's not a sentence. So it's not a sentence, it's only a few words. The finite verb is called the verb phrase, or you could say the non-finite verb, or a combination. Why do we say a verb phrase? You can see here in this sentence, British nurses at Baghdad Hospital have stopped work in protest of low wages. So have stopped is known together, these 2 words together is known as your verb phrase. Have is an auxiliary and your finite verb. Stopped is a past participle and is your non-finite verb. Together you can call them your verb phrase or your finite verb phrase. As soon as a combination of verbs has a finite verb, you can classify the whole bang shoot as your finite verb, or you could say it's a verb phrase with a finite verb and a non-finite verb. So this is just to show different sources talk about this in different ways, but I find it most useful to say that have is your finite verb, even though it is an auxiliary. Stopped is your past participle, and together they are your finite verb phrase. So that is just to differentiate between getting confused. If we say have is the finite, I prefer to call this your finite verb phrase together, have stopped, to differentiate between the finite verb phrase and the finite verb, which is this one word have. Please remember what our auxiliaries are. Most sources say there are 23, and it's easy to remember them with a little song that goes on the tune of Jingle Bells, that Christmas tune. So I'll sing it for you. Linking verbs, there are 23. Am, is, are, was, and were, being, been, and be. Do, did, does, have, has, had, may, must, might, and could. There are 5 more helping verbs, shall, will, can, would, and should. So now you know these are all auxiliaries or linking verbs, and they are finite verbs that can be the finite auxiliary dog. They can take the place of Fani and be known as the finite verb. That's a very cute little song that you can try to sing to remember. Our last little page here shows you that if you have I had swum in that river, had is your auxiliary. Swum is the non-finite verb, the past participle. If you look at had, the auxiliary, we know that's a finite verb, or you could say your finite auxiliary. To be more specific, had swum put together is your finite verb phrase, or you could just simply say your finite verb. So, Pearl wrote a letter. Here we have the finite verb wrote. It is the simple past tense. Pearl wrote a letter yesterday. Pearl was writing a letter at 10 a.m. yesterday. So here we have was is your finite auxiliary. Writing is your present participle. And together was writing can be called your verbal phrase or your finite verb phrase, because a phrase is more than one word. In high school textbooks, however, they like to say that was writing is the finite verb because they don't want to confuse the children by using the word phrase. And it is the finite verb because it relates to the subject, it has a number, and it has a tense. Was writing is the past continuous tense. It relates to the subject Pearl, and Pearl is singular. So there are just different ways to talk about it. The main objective here is to see how these things combine. And if we go back to our poster, then you'll see quite clearly that the very delicate characters at the bottom, the infinitive, the participles and gerund, can't survive without the more sturdy finite verb characters at the top. Finite Fani, auxiliary dog, linking verb Linda, and your transitive and intransitive piggies. Just one last point. You might have remembered that swimming ended with an ing. Whispering, as in she is whispering, ends with an ing. They are non-finites. On the back of my poster, you'll see that I explain the other option that you have for using ing. So you'll see here at the back, we have the swimming duck is on the pond. Swimming duck also ends in ing, swimming. But in this case, it's not a gerund, nor is it a present participle. It is now called a verbal adjective because it has a descriptive quality. It describes the duck. So that's just so that you remember that the ing ending can sometimes be the verbal adjective. And there you have it here on the poster. There's also the answer here. So this little key on the poster shows very clearly how the words are classified which appear in this little sample sentence on the first page of the poster. So that's just to give you an idea of why I put this together, and it gives you an idea of how simple it is. As soon as you've got your head around these characters on the poster, you will understand how finite and non-finite verbs combine. Hope you enjoyed that. This is Elsibe, and you can order this directly from me. My name is on the poster. Thanks for listening.